So would you mind starting with a bit of an introduction? Just briefly let us know a little bit about your background.
Sure. Well, my name is Peter Brown. I grew up in Minnesota in the U.S., and I've had a varied career. I've worked for a big computer corporation, then went out on my own as a management consultant for about 20 years, working with management teams on how to shape their future of their organization. And I retired, and I've taken up writing, and I've published, I think, 5 books. And the most recent one is Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning, which we're here to talk about today, that I wrote with my brother-in-law, Henry Roediger, and one of his colleagues, Mark McDaniel. They are both prominent cognitive psychologists at Washington University in St. Louis. And Roediger, he goes by Roddy. We were chatting at a family event. They were coming to the end of a decade of research into the question, what leads to learning? And what they were finding was pretty counterintuitive. And he said, we're looking for a way to get it to a general audience. And so that's how we decided to collaborate on a book. Me as a non-scientist writer trying to make sense of it and make an engaging book for readers like myself.
Great. And it happens to be one of my favorite books that I've read in the last, I don't know, 5 years or maybe longer. So that I read it, probably about 4 years ago, maybe. And it's something that has now become, or certain tenets from the book have now become central to most of my teaching. And so it had that impact on me. But also there was something just about the way the book was written, and I know that this was a large part of your approach, that made it particularly enjoyable to read and easy to read. So obviously part of the approach that you took was having a, could we say a division of labor in the approach? But there was a sense of, there were the academics and the writer were not the same mind on this, which is quite different from other books. So could you just talk a little bit about what that process was like for you as the writer, and how different maybe it was from the other books that you've written, which admittedly I've not read. So how was that process different for you?
Well, my last major book was a novel, historical novel, steeped in historical detail, but really a story. And so it took a real mind shift for me. I wasn't sure whether this enterprise was going to be successful. And my asking myself, what am I bringing to this? And I felt that if I could contribute, it would be understanding the science well enough to describe it for somebody who wasn't a scientist, would understand it, but would be fully respectful to the scientists and their own degree of rigor. And to do it in a way that was engaging, it wanted to pull you through the book. So I felt that narrative is a very powerful thing that we all relate to, with narratives of our own lives and books we read. And so I tried to include in this book a lot of examples of people, real people I interviewed who are on top of complex knowledge and skill, who can tell me an interesting story of something that happened and how they were able to address this thing that happened and how they learned the material or the skill that they applied in that unexpected moment. And so the book is laced with these stories, but it's around the big ideas that the scientific research shows about how we learn and retain and are able to apply and adapt knowledge. So basically, I wrote the book. I said to them, let's agree on what the different chapters are, what the big ideas are. Then send me the research and let me read the research and ask you questions and see if I can find a way to formulate that into something. And that turned out to work pretty well. Was really something for me to read all those research studies, because so many of them are written in a language I don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. No, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, so the rigor of reading one of these published pieces, all these things are of course peer reviewed and published in scientific journals. But the idea was, can I pull out of each one? What was the question, or the questions they're trying to answer? what do they do? What did they find? And what do they think is the reasons behind what they found?
Yeah.
And if I could do that and then stitch that to the gradual increase in understanding about learning, then I was doing something. But it was arduous and ends up being, of course, a good example of how learning works.
Yeah, yeah, right. I mean, that alone, I think, would be a service, just digesting these academic papers for people without having to write a book the way you did. I mean, I find it a nightmare sometimes trying to tackle, it's important that you stay up to date, but staying up to date is, as you've just said, so arduous sometimes that there's a service just in saying, here's the paper and here's what it means in 5 sentences. And so many teachers would value that.
Here are the questions it leaves on the table. I mean, that's just as important as the ones that take off the table and answers.
Yeah.
And so often I would read a study, and I'd go back into their endnotes of previous research to figure out how they came to this particular question that they were studying. And I'd go back 1 or 2 layers and see what were those questions and what was left on the table from those that still needed to be answered, just to kind of get a sense of the thread of it. But I think this is what journalists do for us everywhere. The science sections of newspapers and other places, they're busy following this and bringing it to us. And so I've taken a renewed interest in the science section of the New York Times and other papers because they're on that watch. They're doing that work.
And I wonder, I mean, there's something about, again, as I say, the book in particular, Make It Stick, and the way that it reads, it does have a unique tone to it. It is readable in the way that I find books in this field are usually either too academic to the extent that they are difficult to read, even for somebody who is comfortable reading at that level, reading that, it's not compelling reading. It's difficult to remain motivated for a full book, let alone a paper. So you have that on the one end. On the other end, they can get a little bit wishy-washy. And not really say anything of value, and they're much more narrative, but they're not really getting much across. And Make It Stick really found that middle ground that I think you went out looking for. And I wonder now, have you been approached by anybody else to say, hey, can you give our academic book the treatment of making it readable to the audience? Is that something that you see any more interest in?
Yeah, I've had a couple. I have a couple invitations like that, which I have not seized. I'm sort of at 6s and 7s about my writing now. Where am I going? What path am I taking? I had to say, this book was published by Harvard University Press, and they have, of course, a peer review process of the book. And I wasn't entirely certain how that would go with them, and I don't know if they were either. But this book has been just continues to be a standout bestseller. It was published in 2006, so it's 2014. I'm sorry. So anyway, it's got great legs. So that worked out. It was a risk they took, a risk we took. It worked out great. So I'm just I'm at a point now where I'm trying to figure out what to write next. What do I really want to do and spend my time on? Because it's a big investment of time.
Yeah, of course. Are you still toying with novel writing as well, or have you?
Yes, I am indeed.
Okay.
There's something about the novel writing that I find is similar to what engaged my creativity in this book, which is you place yourself in maybe another point in time and another location, and you try to get as steeped in it as you can to the daily kind of quotidian life and what is it like and what are the little pieces that have meaning, and then animate it with characters who have real motivations and feelings and so forth. So there's something fun about that, just as there was about working on this science book.
Sure. I mean, in no attempt to compare, of course, but I used to write a bit of poetry, and I used to read a lot of fiction and novels, and I found that as I got more engaged in my teaching career and then into the training and development, and became more committed to reading the papers and writing articles, I now no longer write anything other than that, and I very rarely get to read a novel. And then when I do sit down and think, I'm going to read a novel now, it's a treat. It's something that is, it's sad to let go of, because there is a particular value to that kind of reading, and presumably on your side of the the page to that kind of writing as well.
Right. I read novels both to be engaged, but also to learn how good writers write. And I'm not at all guilty. I don't feel guilty when I read a little bit of a novel and put it aside, saying I've gotten from that what I want. I don't feel. I used to feel an obligation. If you start it, you need to finish it, but I don't anymore. And the ones I do finish are ones that pull me all the way through to the end. So that's an interesting thing about reading for pleasure or for any reason is kind of having a sense of what you're going for. I want to be swept off my feet, or I want to have an answer to a question or several questions, or I want to know how to apply this thing. I got the idea, but I don't know how to apply it.
Yeah. That's another thing about Make It Stick. I find anything that I read that is more towards the narrative side of that spectrum that we laid out earlier, you spend a long time without getting to any kind of application. And that was another thing with Make It Stick. The application was there right from the beginning. And every chapter expounded on something that had already been sort of introduced, delved a little bit deeper, but in a very meaningful way, and then most importantly in a very applied way. I can't imagine how much you must have learned during that writing process about it. And it's, as you say, about 6 years ago now that it was written. So as we sit today, how well are you still versed in the science of learning and retention? Is it something that now is deep within you?
Oh, it's deep within me for two reasons. One is I felt personally highly affirmed by what the science shows. When they went out to do these studies on how do we learn, how to, what leads to learning, and my vernacular term is trial and error. I have a college degree, but I don't have a higher ed degree. And I've done many different things. And the thing that I have done is put myself into a situation where I have to learn something new in order to make a contribution to it. Right. And that's always nervous. You always feel vulnerable. And then suddenly you realize this thing I'm hearing isn't that different from these other things that I'm familiar with. Have you ever thought about this? And you get these mental breakthroughs, which is how learning works. So I felt very affirmed by that. And now, Carl, I've lost the thread of our conversation. I don't even remember what your question was.
No, I think you've answered it actually. So yeah, I'm particularly interested in, because you approach this essentially as the communicator of the idea, right? I mean, that's how how it was set up, and it was your colleagues, your brother-in-law, and your other colleague who were the driving sort of minds behind the science of it all. But I can only imagine your knowledge now of learning and retention and the science of that you must have really retained a lot of what you were writing about. I mean, it must have taken you such a long time to go through that process. You must now be as much the scientist as the others, I imagine.
Well, you flatter me, but we've all three of us been invited to do many presentations, many appearances, workshops, and it continues today. I think we're in 17 foreign languages now. Wow. And so what I've done for my benefit, each of us has a little different approach when we work with a group. I've distilled the ideas in the book down to like 3 big ideas and elaborate on those and try to work in a give and take context with people and draw out their ideas and questions and thoughts and do a little brainstorming and so forth. And that kind of activity over time, if you do enough of that, the material sticks because you're retrieving it, you're elaborating ways, right? And so I do have, I think, still a pretty current grasp of it. And my challenge is whether I want to keep up with the ongoing research or, dive into a fiction setting.
You'll be ready for second edition soon.
Maybe.
So I'd like to know a little bit more about the initial question the initial idea. I don't know if you can speak on behalf of your colleagues at all, but they were in the academic world. You said they were professors, was that right? Or when they
Right.
started?
Yeah, their field is learning and memory, and
Okay.
Henry Roediger, Roddy, actually, he's very highly accomplished. He's in the National Academy of Science here in the U.S. and has really pioneered the field of false memory, and it was out of his depth of knowledge in the field of memory that he was approached by a foundation asking if he would form and lead a group of his colleagues at different universities around the country to try to answer the question of what leads to learning and makes it stick, which the notion of memory. And so that's how they got into it. And it was really through that process that much of this learning about long-term retention has really been developed and understood.
Right. And something that there's a nice hint of intuition in some of it, I found, where some of it is close to what we might expect. But it does a great job, the research and the book does a great job of really going beyond that intuition, filtering out some of the areas that we might intuit incorrectly, and then drilling down on application in particular. I wonder at this point, now that we've talked around it a lot, can you, for anybody who's not yet read the book, could you give us a very brief outline of those three big ideas that as you see them?
Sure. Well, the first one is people tend to think that learning is about observing something and getting the knowledge into the brain. You read something or reread it, you hear a lecture, you watch a podcast, and you get it into your brain, and that you've learned it. And it turns out you've gotten it into short-term memory, but it hasn't gone into long-term memory. It hasn't been connected to the other things that you know. To make learning stick, it really is a matter of getting it out of the brain. There's a certain period of time when you encounter something new that the brain sorts through it and overnight maybe links it into other things you know. So the first big idea is that learning happens when you work at getting learning out of the brain, because that strengthens the connections to what you already know, strengthens the pathways to find it in your memory again later. So getting it out, not trying to push it in. The second big idea is that there are some kinds of difficulties that are desirable. As teachers and learners, we like to make it clear. We like to make learning easy. And it turns out that you need to wrestle with the material mentally in order to make those connections and make it stick. So there's certain kinds of difficulties that the cognitive psychologists call desirable difficulties. One of them is trying to retrieve something from memory. And even if it's a bit of a struggle, and even if you fail, that effort of searching your mind for the answer and then being shown the correct answer leads to better retention and better learning. So retrieving from memory is far more powerful than rereading review. Second kind of desirable difficulty is when you're learning, let's say you're learning solid geometry and you're studying how to find the volume of a cube and the volume of a sphere and a cone. Typically in a math class, you would get the formula for finding the volume of a cube, and you'd practice it on several examples. And then you'd learn the cone and you'd practice that. And during practice, you would get better and better. If you want to learn it well, once you've learned those formulas, you're better off if you get the problems in random sequence, if you mix it up. Then each time you get another problem, you have to say, okay, this was the wedge. The wedge formula, can I remember that? You remember that and you apply that. You become much stronger, but during practice, during learning, it's difficult. and you think I'm probably not getting it because I have to struggle here a little bit. But the studies are stunning that the people during learning who have what we call blocked practice, blocked by problem type, do really well. And a couple of weeks later, they've lost like 80% in a test where the problems come in random sequence. Those whose practice has been mixed up do well, but not that well. And a couple of weeks later, they haven't lost anything. They're doing just as well. So this idea of second kind of desirable difficulty is to mix up your practice instead of doing a lot of this and a lot of this and a lot of this. The third big idea is that retrieval practice is especially helpful if you let some time go by between attempts. So they call it spacing it out. So you encounter a topic or a problem and you come back to it later in the day, or you come back to it later in the week. And the extra difficulty of retrieving it, of locating that in your mind and pulling it forward, it has a really strengthens the connections and the ability to do it again later. So retrieving from memory, mixing up your practice of problem types and spacing it out over time. Anything you want to be able to remember long-term, periodically you have to recall it again later. And if you're a little rusty when you do it, that is especially beneficial. But you want to do it before you have to relearn it, before you've forgotten it completely.
Yeah.
So those are desirable difficulties. So the first big idea is getting it out instead of trying to push it in. The second big idea is there's some kinds of difficulties that make you struggle that strengthen the learning. The third big idea that I pull out of it is that our intuition is not always our friend. It tends to lead us to think when we've reread something or when something's really clear that we know it already or we've got it. And if you have ever pulled an all-nighter and gone into an exam in the morning and come away with a high grade, you've said, I've got this is great, this is the way to go. If you are tested on the same material a week or two later, you will have lost most of it because it wasn't really consolidated. But because you managed to ace the exam, you get this sense that you know it. You have this illusion of knowing. And so this becoming familiar with a text instead of putting it aside and saying, what does it mean? How would I describe it to Carl? Can I think of examples in my life? Does it relate to other things I know? This notion of elaboration and working with the material is not intuitive. An intuitive thing is to reread and reread, watch the video, cram and so forth. So students are not always good judges of what they know and can do. They are much better off if anybody is given frequent low stakes or no stakes challenges, quizzes, tests, or whatever exercise in which they have to recall it and apply it. And then they'll see, either I do know it or I don't know it. And if you don't know, then you need to go work on it a little more. So don't count on intuition. And one of my big concerns is most of the people who invite us to speak are faculty. There's trainers in industry and so forth. But I'm really concerned that students need to be taught how learning works, what kinds of things are a good use of their time and what kinds of things are not a good use of their time. And then for instructors to be very transparent in the training center or the classroom, saying, we're going to trade back and forth with some quizzes and various exercises that are going to be a little bit difficult. And the reason we're doing is because that's the thing that helps you make the connections and make it stick.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And there's something else you said as well about how, the students don't always necessarily know exactly where they are and exactly what they need. There's a big movement, of which I'm a proponent, are moving towards student-centered learning and getting the students in the thrust of their own learning. But one of the things that of late, it's become quite controversial actually to take the position that the teacher does know best in some ways, and especially if it's a teacher who is trained and versed in actually knowing how learning works, which a lot of teachers of course aren't either, but certainly a lot of students aren't. And knowing about these things, particularly the things that you've just outlined, it leads, as you say, and as we now know, it leads to better learning. And if the students can be aware of this, then they're going to learn better. And it does sometimes take a little bit of instruction to make the students aware of that. They won't necessarily be aware of that. And as I say, there is some intuition in there. Some of these things happily line up with intuition, but some of them go beyond, and some of them go in quite a different direction. And there's some very useful research and very useful information there. I wonder, when you embarked upon the project of reading all that research and data and putting it into the book, how much of a singular voice was it then? Because obviously you read a lot of different papers from presumably all sorts of different sources, and what you effectively achieved with Make It Stick was a pretty solid approach to teaching that took in so many different parameters and concepts and put them into a very kind of applicable approach to teaching that a teacher could pick up and say, well, as long as I do these things, I'm going to be having a much more successful learning experience with the students. Prior to your book, was how dispersed was that knowledge, and how consolidated were those ideas? Was it just a broad, messy field of random ideas that weren't being applied before? What was your view of that?
Well, typically, I want to talk just a second on student-centered learning, then come to that question. My understanding of student-centered learning is that students know best about what they need to learn next or how they're doing. One of the big understandings from the cognitive science is that students need to construct their own understanding of the material. Mm-hmm. And so I think that student-centered learning is, depending on how you define it, my definition would be helping the student understand where we're headed in this topic. Yeah. And maybe what the steps are to get there. And then creating exercises or opportunities or assignments in which students make an effort to learn the material. Right. And then have an opportunity for corrective feedback, for dynamic work with other students, to begin to build their understanding. So yes, I think every student is going to come at it a little differently. And that is beneficial, I think, for student motivation. And it can be beneficial for their figuring out a way to create an understanding. Yeah. So in that sense, I think that this science and that notion of student-centered learning line up well. I think there's some people off on one end of the continuum will say, especially maybe some of the homeschoolers where students they're studying what they want to study because they're going to learn that best. And we're not going to worry about a structured framework. Well, education needs a framework. There has to be structure and discipline to it, but you can't spoon feed it. You got to create for students to create that understanding.
Yeah, no, that's how I see it as well. Just to come back on that. Yeah, if you've got that spectrum of the very traditional, purely lecture-driven approach, which, we'd both be familiar with perhaps from our own time in school, just kind of sitting and listening to lectures. And then at the other end of the spectrum is a very extreme version of just kind of free-range learning, which has some value, I think, at some times. But I definitely am with you that we're somewhere, certainly in the second half of that spectrum is where I want to be aiming at. But there is a tendency at the moment to go all the way and take the teacher almost entirely out of the equation. And as I say, I think some structure, some guidance, some goal making is required. Yeah.
Yeah. One example that comes to my mind, the University of Minnesota Medical School is completely restructuring their pedagogy around the science that's reported out and Make It Stick. And they're going away from lecture courses. And they've created a new learning center in which both the science expert and the medical doctor are instructing the students. So you have the science side of it, but you've got the real world side of a doctor.
Yeah. That's great.
But they're also doing things with very short presentations on a concept or a problem, and then students working in groups in a workshop setting and then coming back. It's very iterative. So it really becomes the work of the student in the classroom, as opposed to hearing a lecture and doing Facebook on the computer and whatever, and reading it later and trying to take a test. So I think it'd be much more engaging as a student, and interestingly, it's a difficult challenge for professors who have all their careers have lectured and say, I'm a great lecturer. This is one of the things I do really well. Why are you asking me not to do that? Well, it's because we've discovered that's not as effective as some of these other strategies. So you were asking about how education has evolved, and from what I understand from working in this project is there really hasn't been, there's been educational theory, but there hasn't really been much empirical evidence about what leads to learning. And so this body of research, and it's just not research from the 10 years of this team that I described that my brother-in-law and his colleague headed up, they reached far and wide throughout the field of cognitive psychology and elsewhere. But but really that empirical work has only recently come together and gelled with some pretty definitive understanding of things that work and things that don't work so well. We've gone as a society into thinking that people have individual learning styles, and if they're not presented material that's consistent with their learning style, I'm a visual or I'm an auditory or kinetic, they don't learn as well. We don't have empirical evidence that supports that. There's a whole lot of stuff out there, but if you have rigors of what constitutes a good scientific study, they don't live up to it. Whereas these other strategies of struggling to explain, recall, explain, and space out and mix up your practice, those things have now a very large solid base. And so we're at a point where education can begin to restructure around really a science of learning. And it's advancing, of course, science always does. So we're going to continue to learn more.
Good, yeah. And even on that front, even on the empirical side, I'm often, we talked earlier about the pains of reading some of the papers that go into this and what it means to stay up to date with the research. And I'm often disappointed with research that I read. And one of the reasons of several, one of the reasons being that there's a majority focus on how a particular approach or a particular technique leads to higher scores in tests. And as somebody who cares about learning and doesn't define that as test taking, that's not particularly compelling for me. And often when I read a paper that seems very convincing in its abstract and then find that it's measured by this approach to this test taking approach and exam scoring, it often turns me right off the idea, because on another view, we have a pretty good recognition now that what means good test scores doesn't really mean good learning in a lot of cases. So what I particularly liked about Make It Stick was the inclusion of so much application and the really nice crossover between some of the examples in the book that I remember in particular. The baseball practice, I think, was one, and the especially memorable is the parachuting coach. And these are so far away from the exam hall, but you've got the crossover there. It's rare to see those two things put together and to see that it works in both environments, and that it really is upheld in an applied way, which for me is always the most important thing in research, because I want my students to be able to apply what they learn, not just regurgitate it on exam day.
Yeah, we were invited by the U.S. Naval SEALs to come down and spend a couple of days with their trainers, which was pretty impressive. And a nuclear power plant, there's lots of places where it's not about a grade. It's about being able to show that you demonstrate your ability. But to the point of the grade, I have two comments. One is, I don't know how it is in Jakarta or elsewhere, but in the US, student reviews of teachers are a very important part of the whole tenure track thing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And
Okay.
if you are a professor and you make learning more difficult, you institute more quizzing, you run the risk of getting poor student reviews.
Yeah.
So we have this perversion of incentives and so forth. A good school will figure out a solution to that. And one of the reasons I think it's so important to be transparent as a teacher about how learning works and why we're doing these things that are difficult is so you can kind of deal with that. Students need to be taught to interpret difficulty as learning, not as failure, not getting it. It's learning. You got to try a little different thing or try a little harder. But I also want to go back then to this notion of, there's a lot of places where people are implementing these strategies, but back to the University of Minnesota Medical School.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of the issues there is, in any medical school, is the cognitive load. It's just a huge, stressful thing to be a medical student because of sheer volume of stuff you got to learn and all the pacing and so forth. And they're making a lot of changes with that. But one of the ones that interested me in particular is that there's all these series of tests you have to pass in each of your years going through.
Yeah, right.
They are, they've designed a system where in the clinical years, before residency, and the residency is what the students are going for. Now, as a student, you can ask to be observed by one of the professionals doing something that you have to do well in order to become, to get a residency. So I forget what all these different things are, but it's, you know, it's taking a medical history, it's applying things in different specialties. So you're out and about, and if you get, let's say 100 observations signed off, you get your residency. And you can do it quicker, and you can do it with avoiding some of these onerous steps of the tests. So they're just getting very creative about ways to demonstrate competency, and not confusing that with a grade on an exam.
Yeah, that's great.
So no, I mean, we're all learning how this can be better for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. And for a model of education that's been so unchanged for such a long time, it's great to see any changes. And some of the changes you've described here have been quite radical, actually. So it's great to see big leaps like that happening, and we hope that other institutions follow suit. So I wonder now, as we close, if you've got time for another question, another point. Since the book was written, as you've said a few times now, you've visited various institutions, both in education and in its periphery. What kind of feedback have you received, and what kind of you must have heard interesting stories and thoughts and comments and feedback from teachers that you've met and worked with since the book was written. Are there any highlights you can give us there about what you've heard after the book?
Yeah, it's just been a real rush, actually. Well, I went down to the Florida International University in Miami to speak to faculty and students, and in one of the sessions, Florida International University is made up of mostly first-generation college students. It's got maybe 40,000 student population, very large Hispanic population, and it just does a tremendous service. Well, so one of the people in one of the sessions raised his hand. He said, well, I'm an associate dean of law school here, and we read your book. And so we restructured the law school preparation for the law boards. Okay. Typically, we've placed in 4th or 5th place in the state in our student law board passing. And so we just developed a system in the first year of helping our students understand how learning works, going over to retrieval practice and so forth. And in the second year, where students, with the bottom 20%, we help them rewire their study habits. And by the time I met this guy, he said in the last 5 of the last 6 bar exams, we've been #1 in the state. And the other schools are wondering, what are you doing? How are you doing this? And we've been getting stories like that from many different places. There's a economics teacher at a high school in Pascagoula, Mississippi. The U.S. Pass rate on the U.S. exam for college students in economics about 60%. 66%, I think, is the average pass rate. And in Mississippi, it's been 30%, and in this guy's class, it was about 30%. So he said, we read your book, we decided we would try this. And so he developed a whole scheme of different ways of doing retrieval practice and so forth, and they got up to 60%. It's just, but students bought in. That was the really important point we made. We discussed this, the students bought in, and we did it, and look at what happened. So we're hearing it in many, many places, many really great stories.
Yeah, no, it's great. I can't stress enough not just how much I enjoyed reading the book, but how important I think the book is for teachers and for schools and just for the industry or the field in general to be aware of, because it's a lot of new ideas, and they've been proven to work. And if we're not doing them, so many of the things that we are doing are the opposite, right? The way that exams are often structured, the way that the curriculum is often structured, the idea that you'll learn something now and then you'll be tested on it a few weeks later, and then you won't touch that topic again until 1 or 2 years later, when you're expected to remember it, and the teacher gets annoyed because, well, I taught you this last year, why haven't you remembered it? I mean, this is the model. So much of what we're doing traditionally is the complete opposite of what is in the book. I think it's such an important read, and I think it's been, obviously you've seen the value of it in practice, and I think that's great.
Well, Carl, I'm obliged to you for the opportunity to talk. It's great.
Thanks a lot. So as we finish, is there anywhere in particular that you would send people if they want to know more about that project, but also about yourself, Peter, maybe the books that you've written, some of your novels? Where should people look to find you?
Well, makeitstick.com is our book website. petercbrown.com is mine. You can go there and see about my books. So that's pretty simple. And that's where I'd send you. And if you want to learn more, I mean, there's lots of websites out there now that are running with the science. It's not just Make It Stick. There's a great one called retrievalpractice.org, which is a really great website, working with teachers on how to apply these strategies and breaking it down to lessons and so forth. Another one called thelearningscientists.org. Some of the cognitive psychologists who've been part of this research collaborate there. So those are also really tremendous resources.
Brilliant. So, well, I'll include those links. Yeah, I'll put those links in the description so that people can follow them. And if you do have any more that you think of, obviously let me know, and I'll include those as well. And it's been a real pleasure, Peter. Thank you very much.
Same here. Thanks very much. Good luck with your podcast. I think it's
thanks a lot.
Great.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And keep us informed whenever your next book comes out. We'll
okay. All right.
All right. Thanks a lot, Peter. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.